Hello, I hope you're all doing well. So, let me present to you my talk that I gave this spring in Brazil, in the city of Fortaleza, at the Federal University of Ceará. This talk is about adaptations and the way I teach them at my university in Canada, and also the way we can study them. So this talk is was mostly aimed at the students at this university. So you will see that I'm addressing them mostly, and it's a little bit different from what I usually post on this channel. It's more academic, and it's more like a lecture. But I hope it's not boring, and I hope you will enjoy it. Just a couple of notes. First of all, I've shown 4 clips during my talk, and you will hear me mentioning them. But due to copyright restrictions, of course, I cannot put them into my video. And so I'll just leave the links in the description below, links to these videos. Another thing is that I only recorded my audio, but not my video. And because of that, you will only see the slides and hear my voice. So there will be no video there. And finally, I've edited out some things, mostly technical things, but also the questions period, because you cannot actually hear the people asking questions there, because I was just recording it on my computer. It was not like there was no microphone there. So I've just removed them. Okay. So I hope you enjoy it, and I just want to use this opportunity and thank again Elise, who was the organizer of this talk, but also all other wonderful people of the Federal University of Ceará for their very warm welcome, and for how they treated us and how they made us feel so much at home, and for all the questions that people asked, and for all the conversations that we had before and after this talk. It was great fun. So enjoy. Thank you so much for having me. It's such an honor to be here to present for all of you. It's my first time in Brazil, the first time, of course, first time in Fortaleza. I just really love it. So let me introduce myself before I start talking about my topics. My name is Katia Nekludova, and I work at McMaster University in Canada. And I have a variety of research interests, such as mass literature, fan culture, and adaptations. But today I will be talking to you about adaptations, which is both a subject that I teach, but also a subject of my research. So I teach mostly Russian-related courses, but not exclusively. Well, first of all, I am a language teacher, so I teach Russian for the beginners. So we have students that are interested in this language. And then I teach a couple of film-based courses, and one of them is more related to the history of Russia and of Soviet Union. And so it's called Soviet Propaganda in Film and Other Mass Media. And then I also teach masterpieces of Russian literature in film and TV series. And this is the course that I will be talking about today, because this is a course about Russian literature and adaptations. And then my research, so just as Alice said, I was very interested in the contemporary TV series, and me and my friend and collaborator wrote a book, it's in Russian, about the TV series that are based on Sherlock Holmes. Yes, so there are, well, you probably know a lot of Sherlock Holmes series. I actually am going to mention them a bit later. But we wrote a book, and it was not just about the series, but it was also about the perception of the audience, of the fans, the fan culture. Yes, that is so abundant these days. Yes, and on the internet. And was also very much tied to reader response theory, which is a theory which appeared long before the internet. And it was about the way of analyzing literature, analyzing stories from the point of view of readers. Yes, so because usually we look at text and we try to figure out what the author, what the writer meant, yes, when he or she was writing this. But reader response looks at the audience reaction. And that's something that's very important for me as a person who studies adaptation. Yeah. In the last 2 or 3 years, I've been very interested in studying adaptation perception. Yes, because adaptations, a big part of the adaptation studies is about the perception of the audience, yes, of adaptations of the films that are based, or series that are based of some books. And so I have a project which I'm now, like I'm now in process of working on this with my colleague from Chile, and we are looking at the perception of the same films, but in different audience, in Chilean and in Canadian audience. And I'm also very interested in adaptation as translation, because any translation, especially literary translation, usually involves some adaptation, yes, the process of some adaptation. And so I'm very interested in the boundaries between adaptation and translation. So if you have any questions about any of these topics, please feel free to ask after the talk. I'll be happy to talk to you about this. But yes, so let's start talking about adaptation. I would like to start by talking about the basic interpretation of adaptation. So not as a genre or as a film genre, but as a definition. Yes. So what is adaptation? And this is something that was explored and elaborated by Charles Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace. You see their pictures there. And according to their theory, evolutionary adaptation, or simply adaptation, is the adjustment of organisms to their environment in order to improve their chances at survival in that environment. Yes. So there are different ways to adapt to the environment. Like they can adapt biologically, meaning that they alter their bodily functions. And one of the great examples is Tibet, which is very high in the mountains. And people who live in Tibet, they adapt to these high altitudes. And so their bodies can actually exist and thrive in this altitude with very low oxygen, yes, which for us would have been, very, very difficult. And organisms can also exhibit behavioral adaptation. Yes, so like for example, in Antarctica, the penguins would get together to share the warmth during winter. Yes, in the middle of winter. So this is also adaptation. For us, as we talk about the films and we talk about film adaptations, the most important point of this scientific definition is the idea of adapting to survive or adapting to thrive, right? So because that's one of my arguments, that by adapting a book, in many cases, it prolongs the life of this book. Yes, and it just makes it more accessible to new generations or to a different culture. So we will look at some examples of this. Yeah. So we, as readers and viewers, know that some books age gracefully, yes, and even decades and centuries after their creation, they still grip us, yes. But sometimes time-related obstacles get in our way of appreciating the text. Like, for example, Shakespeare. Yes, Shakespeare. Of course, I'm not a native speaker, yes, of English. But even for native speakers of English, reading original Shakespeare text is very difficult. Yes, because of course the text is very archaic. Yes, so it has a lot of very archaic words, outdated words, but also metaphors, references, jokes that we don't get. So I remember as I was a kid, I really loved reading Shakespeare plays, but I read them in Russian, yes, and it was of course adapted to a modern Russian. It was not an archaic language. And when I learned when I started, you know, reading in English, and I tried actually reading Shakespeare in English, I was just shocked how difficult it is. Yes, because it is, especially of course for a non-native speaker. And this is where adaptations come in so handy. Yes, so there are of course different ways, different strategies of adapting Shakespeare or any other classic that's so well known. In some adaptations, you will see them simplifying language or omitting some things, but sometimes they would actually follow this very faithfully, follow the text very faithfully, but put it into more relatable context, yes, for us. One of such access points for me was this adaptation by Gregory Doran from 2009, Hamlet, and which actually made me, for the first time, connect emotionally with the sufferings of the main hero, because even though they still preserved this very difficult language, it conveyed so much emotion about the man who is burdened with this terrible task of of killing someone, because he is not a murderer. He doesn't want to do it, and so I think it's so brilliantly shown in this film. Another example is A Midsummer Night's Dream, a fantastic adaptation by Emma Rice, which actually I was very privileged to see live in London. And again, it was reinterpreted in this almost Bollywood classic film style, but it made it so much funnier and so much, again, more relatable, that you could really appreciate all these, funny things and innuendos that this play is so full of. So yes, so when we talk about adaptation, of course, there are different ways. We mostly think about adaptation from book to screen or from book to stage, but there are other ways, yes, of adapting something. So, like for example, from film to TV series, and sometimes from TV series to film. Yes, so there are many examples, I'm sure you know, or from film or TV series to video game, or a novelization from film to or TV to book. Yes, so for example, with many famous franchises, you will have it like one of my favorite franchises is Doctor Who, the BBC TV series, and they have a lot of novelizations. Yes, so that there are different ways of again of converting the text, the story, in between these different media. Very importantly, when we experience an adaptation, we need to know the original text, because if we don't know it, we won't be able to experience it. And this is what the scholar who has this monograph about, probably one of the central monographs in adaptation studies, writes about, Linda Hutchin. Yes, she says that to experience it as an adaptation, we need to recognize it as such, to its adapted text, thus allowing the letter to oscillate in our memories that we are experiencing, which means that it provokes some memories of the original text, and it activates this, sometimes the frustration or sometimes the joy that we experience when we watch adaptation. So yes, coming back to this idea of adapting to survive, yes, that we have in science, I just want to say that when we talk about adaptations, the film adaptations, TV series adaptations, they often help us to visualize plots and characters. Yes, and also sometimes, just like in case of Hamlet, for example, Hamlet was placed into very contemporary setting, even though again the text was preserved. Adaptations sometimes place the action into more appropriate settings. Sometimes it doesn't feel right for us, yes, but sometimes it does, yeah. Adaptations and translations adjust the original text to make it more relatable. So just like I said, yes, I read Shakespeare in Russian, and it was much more comprehensible, yes, because it was written in modern language. Again, you can say that maybe it's not the right thing to do, but it surely makes it more accessible. I'm sure that if you think about your experience, or if you watch films or TV series, go to theaters, you will encounter an adaptation at some moments. And while the examples I gave you helped me to appreciate the texts that were otherwise hard to be understood, there were, of course, other examples that, on the contrary, would cause frustration and the universal complaint. This is not how I imagined the hero, yes? Or this is not how the author created them. We usually see these reactions when a famous or beloved book is adapted. I remember how people would discuss Peter Jackson's adaptation of Lord of the Rings, yes, and when it just came out. And being a fan of this book as well, I was really interested in this discussion. And I know I haven't watched the Game of Thrones, but again, I know that there were a lot of discussions about the book and the film, the adaptation, and if they got it right. And especially there were a lot of discussions about the last season, which was not based on George R.R. Martin's book, yes, and or Sherlock, which was actually again one of the subjects of my research, which is also a very interesting adaptation, which kind of plays with the expectations of us if we know this book very well. What is it about a screen adaptation that makes us so eager to see it, to love it, to criticize it, or to hate it? This is what propelled me. This question propelled me to start teaching a course on the foreign adaptations of Russian classics. And this is something that I haven't mentioned before, that in my course, I mostly show them Russian adaptations of these books of Russian classics, but mostly we concentrate on foreign adaptations, mostly British and American films and TV series. So this is a picture from War and Peace. Yeah, so recent, 10 years ago, it was from 2016, also provoked a lot of discussions especially among Russians, but also among other people, in the way they interpreted this novel. For my teaching adaptation of Russian literature, I pursue different goals. One of the goals is to getting to know the classics of Russian literature in English translation, to provoke the interest in these books, yes, of students, because usually the Russian classics is seen as something very heavy, very dark, very brooding, very philosophical, which is true partially, but it's also not true, because I show them that all these books actually match the genres that they know, that they've encountered before, such as social satire or sci-fi or fantasy or psychological thriller or epic historical drama, yes, and so on. So and I think that as soon as you see it in the context of the world culture or of your culture, it becomes much more accessible. So we read short stories and excerpts from the novels because for example, War and Peace, which is a 4-volume novel, it's huge. We don't read it, of course, in the course, but we just read some chapters from this novel. And after reading it, we watch 2 and sometimes 3 adaptations of the same story, mostly 2, yes, and sometimes I show just parts of the 3rd adaptation, mostly Russian adaptation. And we reflect on cultural changes, on historical environment, and we'll look at how this certain country, like, for example, we watch the adaptation of Crime and Punishment that was made in 1930s in the United States. And we talk about the censorship that was affecting the creative choice of the filmmakers. We're talking about the style, the aesthetics, and so on. But we also reflect on our own perception of these adaptations. Yes, because again, when we watch adaptation, and if we have read the book, we always have this gap. Yes, this gap is always present between the book, our idea, yes, which we have inside our head, how this person, these characters, this plot should look like, and its realization on screen. And again, our the emotions that we experience as we watch them. Okay, so in this presentation, I just wanted to show you, to share with you some of the examples of the adaptations that we watch in my course, and I will show you some videos from these films, and also, I will also share the observations that my students usually have about these films. Yeah. So one of the first books that we read is a play by Nikolai Gogol, and it is very popular play that was staged in Russia many times. It is a story about a provincial town in Imperial Russia, 19th century. There is a guy who comes into the provincial town while the officials are expecting the inspector general, who is supposed to come and kind of punish them for all the corruption, the bribery, everything that is going on in the city. And they don't know they don't know the identity of this inspector general, and for this reason they mistake this guy for the inspector general. This guy is not an inspector general. He is just a minor official from St. Petersburg. But they mistake him from this, and from there, you have this comedy. So, they talk about the corruption, the bribery, theft, and the imposter kind of lends some large sums and then flees the town. Yes, and then at the end of the play, the real inspector general arrives. We don't see him. It's like it happens off stage, but this is how the play ends. Yeah, so this is just all about this mistaken identity, the comedy of errors, but also there is a lot of criticism of the imperial Russia, of the corruption, of the bureaucracy, of the bribes, and so on. Yes, that is that is a part of this story. In my course, we watch two adaptations. One is a classic Soviet adaptation, which is almost like a play, like a stage play. Yes, which was filmed. It is very like slow paced and very again very classic Russian play. And another one is very different, even though it's almost the same from the same time. But this is a U.S. adaptation of Inspector General, starring Danny Kaye, who was a very famous musical actor of that time. So a very famous comedian. So I'm going to show you the bribery scene. Yes, so this is the moment when this fake inspector general is confronted by the officials who start giving him bribes, giving him money. Yes, so that he doesn't punish them. So I will first show you the Soviet adaptation, which is much closer to the text, and then I will show you American adaptation, and then I'll talk about the differences. So yes, let's talk about these two interpretations. Yes, in the original text, or also in the Soviet adaptation, we talk about the hero who is a minor official. He takes advantage of bribes and corruption. He gladly accepts them. He flees the town. The official's mistake is revealed, and real inspector general arrives. Yeah, in the US adaptation, well, first of all, it's not Russia, it's some kind of Eastern Europe. The hero is an illiterate crook. The hero goes along with the deception to avoid punishment because he is afraid he will be discovered. He stays in town to fight corruption. And when the real inspector general arrives, the hero is pardoned, the mayor is punished, and the hero becomes a new mayor. Yes, so very happy ending story. And about this particular scene, my students noticed that while in the Russian version we have static shots where it's faithful to the text and the emphasis is on social satire. In the US version we have absurdism, dynamic camera and emphasis on slapstick comedy. Yeah, so in these very absurd situations when he hides everyone in different, parts of his room. So Linda Hutchin writes about the transformations that the adaptations, the text sometimes undergo in adaptations. And she says that to appeal to a global market, a television series or a large stage musical may have to alter the cultural, regional, or historical specifics. So that's my emphasis of the text being adapted. A bitingly satiric novel or social pretense and pressure may be transformed into a benign comedy of manners with the focus of attention on the triumph of the individual. And even though she writes about a different story, this is so applicable to this interpretation of the Inspector General. Yes, so because and I think one of the reasons why it happens is it's because the circumstances of course, of imperial Russia of the 19th century is so different from late 1940s in the United States. So they had to make it more relatable to the American audience. So they would enjoy it more. They would laugh at this. And so they made it into a musical, into the slapstick comedy. They added the happy ending. So the hero is actually much better, like much kinder than in the original text. Another example that I wanted to show you is from Crime and Punishment. So I don't know, maybe some of you have read this novel. This is a psychological thriller, and with the protagonist being a poor student who, out of his desperation, but because also he has some ideas, he commits murder. Yeah, so he commits murder. He kills the old woman who is a pawnbroker. And he also accidentally kills her sister because she becomes a witness to the murder. So that's also happens. So there is a double murder. And the whole novel is actually an exploration of a murderer's psyche and the process of his moral rebirth when he gradually realizes the depth of his crime, of his sin. And so punishment is not just the punishment, that he gets arrested, he is sent to prison, but it's also the moral punishment he undergoes. Yes, and at the very end, he gives himself in, so he admits that he did it, and so he's sent to camps to Siberia. But this is how his moral rebirth and his redemption start. In this book, and also in adaptations, you see very powerful scenes of the battle of wills between the protagonist, Raskolnikov, and his investigator, Porfiry, who doesn't have, he has clues, he has suspicions about him, and he's quite sure that he is the person who committed the crime, but he doesn't have any direct, like he doesn't have proof. Yes, he has to prove it. Because of that, he keeps on pressuring him. The investigator keeps on pressuring the murderer, the protagonist, to kind of, break him down psychologically so that he could admit, that what he has done. So for this, we usually watch 3 adaptations, but I'll only show you the scenes from the 2 of them. And this is the scene of this moral battle between between the murderer and the investigator. So again, starting from the Russian adaptation and then the British adaptation. So this is the Soviet adaptation of early 1970s, and now here is the British adaptation of the early 2000s. Yeah, so of course, again, keep in mind that this is very different time. Yeah. What do we see in these 2 scenes? Yeah, so again, these are not my observations, these are my students' observations. Again, in the Russian version, it's more static, while in British versions, we have very intense close-ups. Yes, and the camera is very moving. Yes, it's not static. We also, in Russian version, we have the battle, this intellectual battle is more intellectual and more serious. Yes, while in British version, the investigator behaves almost like a clown, a trickster, a comedian. Yes, as opposed to the Russian version. And in Russian version, the mood is more somber, more like quiet, while in British version, it's very frantic, and we see it from the murderer perspective. Yeah, so if you keep on watching this scene, you will see that again the camera like it moves around all the time. Yeah, so it kind of conveys his anxiety and his fear of this moment, because he's a murderer, so he is afraid to be to be discovered. So yeah, that's these are just some of these examples of how the adaptations might change and transform, from one time epoch to another. Because again, we are of course talking about 1970s Soviet Union versus 2000s British, British TV series. Very different time, very different aesthetics, but it's very interesting how they reinterpret these scenes. So I just want to say that the reason why we study the adaptations is because we shorten the distance between ourselves and the text, and that's very interesting. It's a very interesting thing to consider, to study. So in my case, it's Russian text. And also for me as an instructor, as a teacher, it's very important to bring my students closer to the Russian text, because again, of course, we are studying Russian text in translation, but Russian text of the 19th century, they are Canadian students. So they are very, very far away from this culture, from this history, from this time period. And so the adaptations help them to make it more relatable. We also observe the mutual influences of time periods. Yes, so again, even with this, especially with the Inspector General, the first, couple of clips that I showed you, we see first the very classical, very, very slow, very faithful adaptation of this play in the Soviet Union, and then we see the US adaptation in very, very typical of that time, musical comedy, very recognizable main actor, yes, who is just, at that time he was a star. And so, so again, it places it into a very specific context, in very specific place in the minds of the audience. We observe the cultural environments, yes, so we see the styles changing from theater to slapstick, or to period drama, and so on. Yes, we also study social issues through these novels, such as corruption, poverty, crime, gambling, or war times, if we talk about War and Peace, for example. Yeah? And we perceive the characters on a more personal level. So all of these things, they are, of course, accessible to us if we read the books, but they become more accessible to us as we watch the adaptations. Yes, and so that's why I think it's really beneficial to teach these Russian novels through the prism of the screen. Yes, through the prism of the adaptation, and also reflect on our perception of the adaptations. One last thing, which is kind of outside of my talk, but I wanted to share it with you because we're in Brazil, and so I just wanted to show you this wonderful example of the adaptation that actually brings our cultures together. There was a fairy tale which was called The Little Humpback Horse, which was written by Pyotr Yershov in the 19th century. And it was not an actual fairy tale, it was a literary fairy tale, which means that it was written, it's not a folk tale. And it is in verse. It did use different motifs from various folk tales. Yeah, so it is even quite categorized in the index of motifs. But it was very popular. And the researcher, the scholar from University of São Paulo, Jerusa Pires Ferreira, she discovered that there is a Brazilian descendant of this tale, the direct descendant. Yes, and that's this book, which is a Cordell book, and it's very interesting because it probably was not just translated, because it's different. Yes, it's different. It has like different characters, but the plot is very similar. Yeah, to The Little Humpback Horse. So what she says is that it probably went through different iterations. So it was probably readapted in different countries, probably through Europe, maybe through Portugal, maybe through Spain, through Southern Europe. until it was brought to Brazil and it was, rewritten as a Cordell book. Yeah. So it is. I think it does show us how powerful the adaptations can be. Yes. So you can have a Russian fairy tale which becomes a part of a very completely different culture, a part of their tradition, but it also preserves a lot of things, such as the plot, or even, the fact that it was in verse, and this book is also in verse. So this is how I wanted to finish it, and thank you. So I hope you enjoyed it.